Hello, I'm Adam Corbin, a partner at Michelmores. I'm hosting this series of podcasts released in the run-up to the Cereals Arable event at Thoresby Estate in Nottinghamshire on the 13th and 14th of June this year. These podcasts accompany a series of articles which you can access on our website. We'll be at the show with our stand, looking forward to meeting and speaking to friends, old and new, hopefully over a cake, gin or ice cream. This time we're going to be speaking about green finance, and I'm joined by Ben Sharples and Alex Watson, who I'm now going to ask to introduce themselves. Ben.
Hello, I'm Ben Sharples. I'm a partner in the agriculture team here at Michelmores and also head of the natural capital team, advising on all aspects relating to structuring and documenting natural capital agreements, whether that's nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, or any other payments for environmental services.
Hi, I'm Alex Watson and I'm a partner in the corporate team here at Michelmores. I focus predominantly on buying and selling, on investments and equity and debt finance and fundraisings, focusing very much on the sustainable development and sustainable infrastructure aspects, and work closely with Ben and with Adam when it comes to investments into the natural capital space.
Great. So I think the first thing that we need to ask is what we really mean by green finance. Ben, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a big question, and I think it depends really on whether you're talking about whether you're greening finance or financing green, as the government rather pithily put it on their website. But I think it's quite a good shorthand, because greening finance is about embedding environmental issues into the financial world. To give an obvious example, if you're not hitting your sustainability targets, it's going to cost you more to borrow money in the future, because lending institutions are hardwiring sustainability initiatives into their policies and into their lending criteria. So that's a real sort of seismic and structural change in the financial world. But I think what we're aiming at more in this podcast is financing green, which is delivering environmental outcomes through the introduction of private finance into the natural capital space, and creating a return for investors, but also creating public benefit in meeting environmental goals.
Alex, would you agree with that?
I would, and Ben has stolen a bit of my thunder for a topic that I know we're going to be talking about a bit later from the government's Green Finance Initiative. But yes, very much green finance at a very macro level is looking at all the financial flows into sustainable development practices. So when we talk about green finance, it's everything from sort of economic policy and the regulatory frameworks in place to deliver economic returns and growth within that kind of ESG agenda, everything down to looking at how you might invest in a small scale project on your land. So all of the above is captured. But as Ben says, we're going to focus very much on that aspect of green finance, which is on natural capital.
Ben, what examples are you encountering in practice at the moment?
Well, all sorts and all scales, really, from large catchment scale projects to deliver cleaner water through the various water companies. We're seeing a collaboration between those organisations to deliver those landscape scale changes. We're also seeing investment by private companies in their supply chain. So a good example for that would be Nestlé project up in Cumbria with their dairy farm, their milk suppliers, who are improving the peatland and upland habitat in return for higher milk prices and delivering sustainability through the supply chain. And then perhaps the most interesting one at the moment, and the most topical one, is large-scale forestry and tree planting using corporate money, which then sees carbon credits being delivered, and then the potential for other environmental services to be stacked on top of that, which would generate a further return for investors.
How about you, Alex?
So I've been involved pretty much all my career in these kind of investments and M&A activity within sort of the sustainable space. So looking back, there's been a real push in recent years to a sort of decarbonisation of the food sector, energy sector, heat sector, transport sector, and the land sector. And Ben's given some great examples of what we're seeing within land and food. There's lots of activity that's historically taken place with a push towards renewable energy and renewable heat, as well as much more focus now on renewable transport. And we've had lots of experience in investors moving into that space, taking advantage of government subsidies and incentives, and really sort of monetizing and commercializing that space. So, as Ben says, lots of activity and lots of ways of looking at it and lots of opportunities.
It seems like this is all happening very fast, and it seems also like this might be the next gold rush, the next dot-com bubble. Is that right, or is it much more regulated than we expect? Alex?
So, as I said earlier, green finance is, and Ben mentioned it as well, is a massive, massive area. And there's some aspects of it that are very heavily regulated. If you think about it, we've got everything from commercial banks and big investment funds and listed companies, all of which have got regulation, some very heavily regulated, some less so. And then other areas of the economy which still interact with green finance, which are actually very unregulated. And we're going to come on to talk about the government's green finance initiative, but that's looking to actually introduce regulation in order to encourage the policy and the culture going forward where we don't have it. Ben's been really heavily sort of involved in the natural capital side of the regulation. Ben, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, it's partially regulated, and you have to look at what the markets are at the moment. And you have, in terms of the burgeoning markets and what's driving this area forward, it's biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality. And biodiversity net gain, we have the structure of the Environment Act 2021, but we don't have any of the underlying secondary legislation that gives us the detail as to how these schemes will properly operate. And we're all waiting for that. And the latest news from DEFRA is that is going to be further delayed. We're not likely to see any regulations until the end of this month at the earliest, and it's quite possible that we won't see the secondary legislation under the Environment Act until right before the deadline of November this year when the Act comes into force. So there is this slight tension between it's a statute-based scheme, but we don't have the operational detail. Nutrient neutrality is slightly different. The need for that derives from European case law, and Natural England have issued guidance, and the LPAs are implementing that at a local level. So we have some structure there. You then move further afield, the carbon markets. We have the voluntary markets of the peatland carbon code and the woodland carbon code. There's regulation there. There's regulation in the form of the UK emissions trading scheme. That is a much more familiar and established marketplace. And investors are quite comfortable, it seems, in dealing with that aspect. Where it's going to get more difficult is the stacking and layering on top of biodiversity net gain and of nutrient neutrality and other payments for environmental services. And I think where it's going to really be tested is this much wider market for private investment by corporates and other organizations into the natural capital space so that they can burnish their ESG credentials, so that they can, putting it bluntly, make themselves look better by investing in improvements in the environment. And that is where we're going to see real need for closer scrutiny and closer regulation. But at the moment, it's a bit fluid, it has to be said, and we're operating and drafting without a lot of the detail that we would normally have. But that's fine, we can do that, and others are managing it as well. So the market is developing.
Alex, at a corporate governance level, there is some regulation, isn't there? Could you just briefly, broadly explain what that is?
So the governance that we have at the moment depends very much on the size and the type of corporate entity that we're looking at. So if we look at the very largest companies, the listed companies, there's already obligations to what's called comply or explain in respect of, broadly speaking, your green agenda. That isn't just environmental concerns, there's also ones around social concerns, but just for these purposes, we'll talk about the green side of things. Very little exists if you come out of that sort of cohort of organisations. So from that perspective, and I know we're going to come on to it in a little bit, the Green Finance Initiative is looking to extend that so there's a cultural shift towards what sort of adopting what we've already got for those very largest companies and moving that to a wider sector of the corporate sphere.
Before we move on, Ben, to think a little bit about the Green Finance Initiative, could you just talk us through where we are on measuring these environmental goods that people are buying and selling?
Yeah, I mean, if we start with biodiversity, we have a sophisticated tool called the biodiversity metric, which DEFRA have just, or Natural England rather, have just released the latest iteration, 4.0, which has undergone some changes. And that works out crudely what biodiversity a site has, what will be lost by development, what a mitigation site might provide, and then you can work out your net gain that you need to produce to comply with your biodiversity obligations. And that's all of these schemes depend on that value, which is rather tokenistic in nature, being underwritten by the proper management of the land to deliver the habitat, the biodiversity, whatever it is that you're pledging to commit to. And that's the key to all of these schemes. And that is what investors will want to see. And I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that in more detail later. Carbon is as I said earlier, is rather more established, and you can calculate that using the established framework. And nutrient neutrality is about creating an offset, reducing nutrient flows of phosphate and nitrate into watercourses, and taking land out of agricultural production to create that offset, that credit, to allow development to take place. So there are different ways of working out the value of these units, but the single sort of unifying theme is that they have to be underwritten by these commitments, these legal obligations, which is why we've structured these deals in the way that we have, using Section 106 agreements and so on, in the absence of conservation covenants.
And just jumping in there, if I may, Ben, one of the really interesting things is that we've got to navigate this environment of a lack of sort of legislative framework, but still try and find a way of monetizing what we're talking about to make it attractive for investors. Because ultimately, either you need to self-fund a project that we're sort of talking about in order to do this, or you need to find external funding. And I know we'll talk about what might be available to people a bit later on in the podcast, but actually it's packaging this up in a way that will be attractive to investors. And very much in the Green Finance Initiative, we're going to talk about that sort of idea of financing green and making it attractive to invest in this space. So it's really, really important that when we're looking at structuring these deals, and Ben and I and you have been involved in a number of these now, that we've always got one eye on making sure that it is going to be attractive for investment, because ultimately that's what you are going to need in order to get these off the ground.
Well, so I was going to say, I mean, that's absolutely right. And that is why it is so crucial that we get guidance and everyone understands what you can do within the framework of these individual schemes, whether they are publicly funded or whether they are privately funded, and where the lines are, as it were, so that this is this concept of additionality, so that you can have a site that provides nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain. Can you then exploit that for carbon? And the answer to that question will depend on whether or not the trees that are producing the carbon are a genuinely new additional environmental input. But this stacking and bundling and additionality is crucial for private and public investors, because they will want to know what they are getting for their money, whether, as Alex says, they are funding the tree planting or whether they are looking for longer term returns over the period when those trees will be growing and producing carbon.
Just with regard to what you're buying and what you're selling, is it possible, though, that regulation is irrelevant because it's up to the buyer and the seller to determine the quality of what's being sold and what's being purchased, and it doesn't really matter how that's regulated, because the better the product, the more money will be paid for it?
That's right to an extent, but if you take biodiversity as an example, biodiversity is an obligation on developers to improve what was there before by 10% or more in some cases. And there is the possibility that unless there's regulation there, that would become more of a tick box exercise, and the quality of the habitat that's being provided, isn't necessarily there. I think the regulation is going to be put in place. There will be biodiversity gain site register, so that the sites have to go on there so that everyone knows where they are. They can be monitored. It can be ensured that the habitat is being produced. So I think where there's a direct link like that to development, there needs to be a framework of regulation. Perhaps for the other environmental markets, it will come down to, quality will out. The ESG market, for example, companies will not want to be investing in a tokenistic scheme because it will reflect badly on them. So they will want a blue chip delivery, of proper environmental improvement, so that they can say, look, we funded this woodland in Northumberland or wherever it might be. go and have a look at it, shareholders, and see how great we are. That market may need less regulation because it will be self-policing, because it'll be reputational issues that will come to the fore. But where you've got obligation with either European or domestic law in terms of nutrient neutrality or biodiversity net gain, I think there you're going to need to see the framework and the detail, and we just don't have that detail at the moment. But we're coping perfectly well, but it would be nice to see it.
So let's move on now to the Green Finance Initiative, Alex. Is this a panacea? Is it going to solve the problems that we've been discussing so far?
In short, probably not as it currently is, but it's a great step forward just to see, for all of us who've been in this space for a long time, that we are moving forward towards these international and domestic commitments that we've made. So the Green Finance Strategy is very much a policy framework to deliver the UK as forefront of a rapidly growing green finance market and bringing the private investment to deliver that strategy. Very much so a focus around the UK becoming the first sort of net zero aligned financial centre. So big ambitions. And Green Finance Strategy, as Ben has already sort of mentioned, covers a couple of sort of main ideas, the concept of greening finance and then the concept of financing green. So greening finance is what we've been talking about, sort of making those financial risks and opportunities from climate and the environment sort of absolutely integral factors within your decision making as a business, making it very much a mainstream part of your decision framework. And then the financing green side is making it attractive and accelerating investment to support the delivery of these targets. So the initiative definitely goes some way towards addressing those, and some interesting ideas in there, but whether or not it will be the panacea that you have alluded to remains to be seen. And the skeptic in me suggests probably not, but hopefully a good start.
So, Alex, perhaps you could also just talk us through the three strands of the Green Finance Initiative.
There are three main strands to the initiative, and that is the foundations, where we talk about sort of culture and what we're looking to achieve, then the align strand, and then the invest strand. And the align strand is the one that we're probably most interested in some ways, because that's the bit which talks about regulation and the cultural shift that they're trying to achieve. And there are some key pillars within that, which is sort of the concept of transparency, of reporting throughout the whole of the value chain. So businesses will need to improve their reporting generally. And we've got that in some of the larger companies, as I've mentioned, but moving that throughout the wider sort of business community. Moving towards a culture of sustainability, providing frameworks, as I've said, to talk about that. Sustainability is a key part of decision making. And then the invest is very much that kind of idea of the increase of availability of finance for this net zero transition. So those three main concepts, as we've said, the concept of the foundations, what we're trying to achieve, alignment, which is the policy and the cultural shift, and then invest, which is that kind of concept of moving money into this area to support the growth and movement.
Ben, which part of that, all of that, are you most interested in? Are you most excited about, if any?
For me, it's more about the nature markets framework, really. That is more relevant, I think, for landowners and farmers in this country. That, I mean, the Green Finance Strategy is very aspirational, and clearly the aim is to make the UK a centre for that type of investment and to make us very efficient and good at it within our own borders. And that's all very laudable. But I think on a domestic scale, it's the nature markets framework, as I say, that is more relevant. I suppose one of the aspects of the Green Finance Strategy, which is interesting, is their sort of hint that they may well look at standardising biodiversity and other ESG type credits in the future, so that we have more of a recognisable market in that area we discussed earlier, which for me is the big potential market. We've got the set statutory biodiversity market, we have the nutrient neutrality market, but then this wider ESG market where you might be buying credits for biodiversity, for forestry, for clean water and so on, and whether or not we see a standardized approach to that could be interesting.
Ben, I think we should go on a little bit more about the nature frameworks.
Well, the nature markets framework is really the government's aspiration about scaling up of private investment in these natural capital markets that we're talking about, and really shows the aspiration in growing that. It talks about the blending of public and private money. And that is a really important principle, because the way that farmers and landowners will receive public money in the future is under a very sort of strict contract, really. It's public money for public goods is the way it's been explained. And it is important because that public money will see schemes being implemented at varying levels of complexity on land across the country. Now, at the very lowest level, that may require relatively little input by a landowner or farmer, but equally at the top of the pyramid of support is landscape scale recovery, and that will involve collaboration between landowners and quite complex landscape changes. And it's at that level that private investors are likely to be attracted to putting money in, because you've already got the scaling up of land, so you've got the economies of scale, and you can achieve real environmental benefit when you're working at that level. So at that point, public and private money will work very well together. So this nature markets framework is an important document, because it sets out how this blending of finance is going to hopefully come about, and also deals with these difficult concepts of stacking, bundling, additionality, and so on that we talked about, because the government clearly identify that there needs to be clear rules around that so that people investing will know what their return is. And equally, the Treasury will know that they're getting a fair return for their money, because landowners aren't being paid twice to do the same thing.
So, Alex, you've explained a little bit about the obligations on listed companies, and that the Green Finance Initiative is introducing the idea of further regulation for smaller companies. Could you just explain a little bit more about what sort of obligations there might be on those companies in the future?
Yes, there's nothing in the green finance strategy that says exactly what it looks like and what we're expecting it to look like, but it has mooted that it's likely to follow the comply and explain rules. Comply and explain is the concept that if you are not complying with good governance, you have to explain why you are not doing that. And good examples of that have been every single governance initiative that they've looked to put in without it being sort of complete legislative requirements. And many people will be familiar with these from audit as well, because there's a lot of this concept of comply and explain within the audit rules. So going forward, it is likely that you will have to comply or explain in circumstances where you have got to develop a net zero strategy, where you have got to demonstrate your thinking and your decision making towards that net zero strategy and your net zero transition. So everyone should expect, and the degree to which this will be a requirement, depending on the size of the organisation in place, we don't know, but everyone should expect that going forward there will be much more transparency required as to what your net zero transition looks like, and if you haven't got a strategy in place, why that is.
So just unpacking that a little bit more, let's say that I am the director of a company that turns over £100 million making widgets, and I decide that it's really going to be very expensive for me to net zero my production process and my supply chain process. Can I just explain that I can't comply because it's all too expensive and too difficult? Or is there some sort of threshold that I need to meet?
Good question. Don't know the answer to that as to the extent of whether there's going to be a threshold and whether a £100 million turnover will put you in or outside of the regime, because none of that detail currently exists. However, if you have to look at it from the investor's point of view, I suspect both now and increasingly in the future, you are going to struggle to get investment. You're going to very much struggle to get third-party debt from mainstream and alternative lenders if your approach to the net zero transition is it's all a bit difficult and it's all a bit expensive. Because ultimately, there's a definite movement towards net zero. It's definitely on the agenda. And increasingly, you'll see that banks, investors are looking to boards to actually grasp this and move forward. The days of putting your head in the sand, I think, are very much over. The question, I suppose, is how quickly we're going to get there. So I don't think we can recommend the approach of just explaining why you haven't done it, but we can definitely say that explain why you haven't done it yet and what your plans are for the future. And then each reporting cycle, hopefully you are making strides towards that net zero transition.
And last question, is it all about carbon, or are there other aspects too?
So the net zero transition is very much focused around carbon and the sort of environmental side of things. But you'll find that a lot of the dialogue and the rhetoric goes beyond that. So very much think of it as the three strands of ESG, because they're quite a nifty way of thinking about it. So you've got the environmental side, the social side, and the governance side. So the governance side we've talked about: reporting, transparency, comply or explain. Social side has very much been on the agenda over recent years, but continues to be on the agenda. And the environmental is the real push that you're seeing in the green finance strategy, in the nature frameworks, all about focused around carbon, definitely, but wider sustainability, wider environmental credentials.
Let's move on to two concluding questions, two for each of you, really around the future for investment. Let's say I'm a landowner and I'm looking to attract some sort of green investment. What am I best to do now? What opportunities exist now? And what opportunities should I be thinking about in the future? Ben?
I think the first point is to be very aware of your own requirements for mitigating carbon and dealing with all of these issues, just in terms of your own business and your own supply chains. The pressure from retailers, supermarkets, and so on, milk purchasers, we've just seen that increase hugely in the last few years. I've been involved in drafting milk supply contracts where, issues of sustainability, deforestation-free soya, water use, electricity use, carbon, all of these issues have come to the fore. So you've got to get your own house in order. So I would be very, very reluctant to trade away my own carbon sequestration potential and then be left hanging in the future and having to go out onto the market and buy it possibly at an increased cost. At the moment, the cost of carbon, the values on the auctions are not that exciting, but it is sod's law, isn't it, that if you trade it away cheaply, you'll then have to buy it expensively. Sell wholesale now, buy retail later is the worry. So I think that's the first point. The availability of private finance opportunities at the moment really are largely biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, or some sort of private investment scheme involving forestry or some other land change. I think those have to be appraised on their merits. If you've got land that is marginal, you were thinking of doing some sort of tree planting or something anyway, and a lot of landowners are in that position at the moment, then if there's a private scheme available, consider it on its merits. I think the point to observe is that when documenting those schemes, you need to have at the front of your mind this concept of additionality and of stacking these services on land. So you need to be clear about what environmental inputs you are carrying out, whether that's tree planting or whatever, and so that you can draw a clear line between these different activities on land and say, look, I did that for the purposes of carbon sequestration or biodiversity. This is a new scheme and therefore it's a new income stream. What we've seen under the nature markets framework is the likely approach by government that if you've got land, you can use it for both biodiversity and nutrient neutrality. That's fine. But under the scheme rules, you wouldn't be able to use that land for carbon sequestration through tree planting unless the tree planting was demonstrably new and separate from the nutrient neutrality and the biodiversity. So it wasn't needed for habitat, for biodiversity, and it wasn't needed for nutrient uptake for the nutrient neutrality scheme. So you have to show these new additional benefits in order to get the extra income.
So we're going to pick up these strands on stacking in particular when we do the developer topic a little bit later on in the series. So it'll be good to explore those issues a little bit further with you. But it's clearly an interesting time. Alex, how about you? What are you going to do or suggest that a landowner does now and in the future?
So I suppose all the things that Ben has talked about needs to be funded. So looking at it from this perspective that I come from it, from the area of law that I deal with, you can fund these things yourself. You can go and get a loan from the bank. You can do it in the traditional way, which would be secured against the existing business, against the existing land. So obviously pros and cons to that. Very much looking to the future, there are lots available now, but very much in the future, you're going to find lots more opportunity for investment from both specialists and alternative lenders and investors, as well as moving towards mainstream investors as this becomes more and more relevant. We talked about financing green and greening that finance. So this is going to become much more prevalent in the future. And as Ben says, you've got to really understand the value of the land. And you know that investors are going to want to know how you're going to make a return on that investment. So having a really solid understanding of what's available, what your offer is, how you're going to service that debt, how you're going to service that equity is really important. And as we move forward, there's going to be, I'm sure, much more opportunity for investment. Something that's worth flagging is that now, whether you're a mainstream or an alternative lender, there's definite push towards sustainable lending. And the reason for that is that you can see preferred terms available where you've got a genuine sustainable underlying business. So there's real opportunity and the definite options out there for landowners.
Thanks, Alex. So the second question then was from a buyer's perspective. Let's say I'm a high net worth individual and I'm looking for some investment opportunities. What am I best to do now, Ben? And what am I thinking about for the future?
I'd be looking at, again, having an eye on what the opportunities are from this market. If you're simply looking to pump private finance into a natural capital scheme, a lot of it is about your own aspirations and your own values and what you want to get out of it. Because, whether it's a local scheme, whether it's something very close to your heart in terms of, ecology or whatever it might be, because at the end of the day, a lot of the value, and there's a lot of talk about value at the moment, but a lot of the value in these schemes will be in the sense of doing good, the sense of investing in the future. So it's not all about the money, although clearly, as we've identified in this podcast, it is very important. I think that, again, you've got to have half an eye on the future. This market is going to develop. We're going to see much more variation in terms of money coming in for different environmental outcomes. At the moment, things like flood prevention, there's a huge potential there in terms of the insurance market and the amount that's paid out each year in claims and the increased premiums. We're also going to see things like green prescriptions, the importance of mental health, the benefits that walking in a wooded environment can bring and all the rest of it. So I would be thinking about how the market's going to change and whether or not I keep some of my powder dry for the future, because at the moment, the markets are in a fairly embryonic stage.
So, Alex, like all good lawyers, you're going to tell me that you don't give investment advice and that your high net worth individual should consult a decent IFA. But could I press you to tell me what the most likely sources of investment into landowners' projects now are and what the future looks like?
I agree wholeheartedly that a good IFA is probably where your high net worth needs to start with all this. I suspect, though I'm obviously happy to be proven wrong, that we will see the alternative specialist investors being the first movers. We've already seen that. Michelmores has been involved in a really high profile biodiversity net gain project, and there are many others following. And those first movers are the specialist investors who really understand and want to move into that market. And you can, the high net worth can invest in those funds. Going forward, I suspect that there'll be many more opportunities to put your money in sustainable infrastructure funds. There are a number that are there now, but moving forward, there's increasingly specialist funds as well as just mainstream investments and mainstream funds that are going green. And a lot of that is to do with the stakeholder pressure that we've talked about the importance of that transition to net zero. But there's definitely investment opportunities where you can put your money either into a smaller company that might be on a crowdfunding platform, or you might come across, in another way, or into the bigger, investment funds, pension funds who are, and commercial lenders, I suppose, who are focusing on this area.
That side of things is very interesting. I spoke at IPFA, International Project Finance Association, the other day, and what was clear from that was that the interest from a project finance perspective is in the large scale opportunities that exist, whether they are domestic or sort of impact investment abroad type projects. But I was on a panel with a forestry specialist and estate owner. They were both recognizing that doing this on a small level doesn't win for anyone. It doesn't win for the environment. It doesn't win for the investors, and therefore scale is where the opportunities are. And so I think that translates to, if you're a high net worth individual investing in these things, where do you want your money to be? Well, you want it to be working well at every level. So you're looking at the larger scale schemes. That's not to say small areas of land can't make a big difference, because they can be strategically important. But what it comes down to, again, is the need for collaboration at ground level, because if everyone gets together, everyone can help solve this problem.
And just jumping in there, that's very much the experience that we've seen with the decarbonisation of energy, of transport, and of heat in particular, where it's been scale, it's been project finance led, it's been specialist and alternative lenders who've gone into the market. They've created a real sort of buzz and investment opportunity, and then that's become more mainstream. And I don't see, unless Ben thinks otherwise, that this will be any particularly different, because actually this is a completely new asset class in many ways. There are going to be investment risks, and actually it's those who are really forward thinking and who can really understand how the revenue stacks work that are going to invest and make a go of it and then make it mainstream.
I think that's absolutely right. And we're involved in a number of projects on landscape scale recovery, where we've advised estate owners and groups of landowners about how they aggregate this land and how they spread the risk and how they bring everyone together to deliver the environmental outcomes. But one of the things, we're also involved in private finance investment in large scale forestry. And one of the points I made when speaking the other day was that this is not like buying government gilts. Investing in nature is inherently high risk, because not only have you got all the market variables that you have in other financial sectors, you've got the variables of climate change, obviously, that's what we're trying to deal with, and things like disease. If you're just looking at forestry, the prevalence of disease in native species in this country is really worrying. What do you plant? How do you cater for that? How do you cater for climatic events? All of this has to be thought about by the advisors, and it ramps up the risk. But again, it comes back to, if you're doing it at scale, you can mitigate that risk by scale and by diversification. So there's a lot to think about, but huge opportunity.
And just talking about that scale opportunity, actually the larger scale that is, and whether that's scale just by numbers or scale by actual acreage, the more you look to mitigate risks, the more you look to diversify, the more complex you're going to end up with a structure. And that's where you have got real value added from advisors, because really there's so many things to think about. There's so many risks, there's so many ways of looking at things, and there's so many things that can go wrong as well as going right, obviously, that there's a lot of thinking to be done, and there's a lot of careful consideration of all these factors, and currently in what can only be described as a very nascent legislative framework.
Great. Thank you ever so much, both of you, for your time and for your really interesting thoughts. Before we finish, I just wondered if I could ask you what you're both looking forward to most about going to Cereals this year. How about you, Ben?
Seeing lots of shiny kit, and talking with people, like-minded people about this, because I think what will be interesting about Cereals is it's not just about production, which of course is vital, particularly in these times where food security is a massive issue, and we must not lose sight of that. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see the natural capital side alongside the production. I think that will be, a fascinating discussion.
So, Alex, I think it'll be your first time. You've not been before. I can confirm that the Wurzels are coming to perform, so that's surely a tick in the box for you. But is there anything else you're looking forward to?
Well, the Wurzels probably are the number one priority, because they did actually play at my university graduation. So it will not be the first time I see them. So that's very exciting for me. I think, just as Ben says, getting to speak to everyone there and getting to really understand what they're seeing in the market. And obviously there's ice cream. So we mustn't underplay the importance of that.
Ben, Alex, thanks ever so much. See you next time.